Good afternoon, everyone. I have a pleasure to chair this afternoon session. And our first speaker in this session is Oren Siegel, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. He specializes in Egyptian archaeology with a particular focus on monumental architecture, urbanism, landscape archaeology, and the materiality of borders in the ancient Egyptian world. Oren was the junior researcher with the Borderscape Project and an assistant professor at our institute in 2021 and 2023. And today he will present a paper titled Defining and Theoretizing Borders in Pharaonic Egypt. Oren, the digital floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be presenting to you all. I dearly wish that I could be there in person for this closing symposium for the Borderscape project, and I just want to begin by thanking Maria for inviting me to give this short presentation today, and of course for just letting me be a part of her wonderful team. And I also just want to take a quick moment to also thank and highlight the efforts of Serena Nicolini, whose hard work on the data set and many other aspects of the project really can't be overstated, and also Alberto Urchia and Julian Bogdani, whose work with some of the more technical aspects of the WebGIS was invaluable as well. So I'm really excited to have the chance to discuss some theoretical approaches to border making in Pharaonic Egypt, and really, I'll be focusing more on the Middle and New Kingdom periods today, since for these periods we can rely on a robust corpus of both archaeological and textual evidence. And so in particular, I'm going to be focusing on political borders in ancient Egypt, which is to say what they look like, how they operated, and how they were conceptualized. So I want to begin by noting that with both ancient and modern boundary making, there are differences between the state's intentions for a political boundary and the lived experience of individuals in the borderlands. I want to emphasize that I'm analyzing how the ancient Egyptian state conceived of boundaries, not because of the primacy of the state's vision, but rather to challenge what I believe are some tenuous assumptions regarding how the Pharaonic polity was defining its borders that have then informed how scholars have interpreted life in such borderland regions. So one of the elements that I want to explore with this talk is how perceptions of space and territory can vary considerably depending on cultural context. And before considering the context of Pharaonic Egypt, I want to begin by situating us among the political borders we encounter ourselves. We all inhabit an extraordinarily bordered world. The Polish Academy of Sciences supports scholars from all across the globe, and many of us flash an ID card on a daily basis to enter a university or library building. I'm sure some of us here in person or attending via Zoom cross municipal or provincial lines during our commutes, and we are inured to invasive searches every time we board a plane and submit to passport checks that collect copious amounts of personal data whenever we travel beyond the bounds of our respective nations. The past decades have witnessed a proliferation of border walls that, despite their hefty price tag and questionable effectiveness, serve as powerful nationalistic symbols. Almost everywhere in the world, a glance at the front page of a newspaper confirms that nearly all of our human rights derive from our citizenship within a nation state and the vulnerability of the stateless or refugees within the world order that we have built. As someone who grew up really a matter of miles from the US-Mexico border, I have to say that this is an issue that resonates on a personal level for me. In our international order, virtually all states claim a monopoly on the legitimate right to exercise violence within their carefully defined borders. Different states might violently disagree about where a border should be located or who can freely cross it, but essentially, no polities are challenging the organizing principle that sovereignty is grounded in territory. It's not uncommon to hear about natural boundaries situated around rivers, mountains, or other key geographic features But I would argue that this itself is also a socio-political process. There's nothing natural about where, say, international waters begin. This is something that states have to come together and agree on and negotiate. So to this point, I just want to highlight that I think that our system of borders is very much historically contingent. It's hard to imagine them looking the way they do now if we lacked the technologies of the industrial age or the data collection and aggregation tools from our own information age. In fact, it's quite possible that they would be drastically altered if ideas about private property were approached just a little bit differently in the early modern period. It's precisely because the political boundaries that we ourselves experience are often fairly broadly similar, but also the product of this particular historical process that I think we need to carefully re-examine some of our assumptions when we talk about these features during the Pharaonic period. Before addressing Egyptian border-making efforts, I think it's also necessary to define what I mean by some of these terms, like border, frontier, and boundary, and how I'm going to be using them today, since quite a bit of confusion arises from the semantic overlap between these ideas. I think the late Bradley Parker's studies of Neo-Assyrian frontiers and borderlands are extremely useful in this regard, not least because his research explicitly includes pre-modern boundary-making practices. Parker situates borders and frontiers along a continuum of boundary types, with borders being more static and less permeable than frontiers, which he views as relatively more fluid and porous. For Parker, boundary is a general term that encompasses the totality of this spectrum, while borderlands are comprised of the geographic, mental, social, and metaphysical spaces where borders and frontiers are imposed. Critically, he notes that in the ancient world, not all territory was claimed, and a polity's boundaries were often delimiting it from the surrounding wilderness rather than political rivals. Though extremely useful as a device for interrogating the reality of life in borderlands, the spectrum between Parker's borders and frontiers maps imperfectly onto Egyptian terminology, where two types of boundaries are commonly distinguished, tashu and jeru. However, the distinction between these terms reflects neither porosity nor permeability, but rather the capacity for human action to change them. Jeru refer to purportedly immutable normative boundaries, while Tash has traditionally been translated by Egyptologists as a sphere of influence or a frontier, though others simply prefer the term boundary. Crucially, Tashu belong to the realm of boundaries or limits that may be set and altered through political action, and especially those actions undertaken by the pharaoh. In fact, the formation Suesek Tashu, broadening the boundaries, has been cited as a mode that Egyptian sources used to describe the imperial ambitions of the Pharaonic state. Jose Galan notes that Tashu must be actively constructed, while Jeru were more passive features, a distinction that is reflected in how the terms are employed. Jeru are often brought to victorious Egyptian pharaohs, while Tashu are made or established, nearly always by the ruler, and must be maintained through subsequent border-making efforts. I would argue that on a basic definitional level, the Pharaonic Egyptians are conceptualizing their boundaries in a fundamentally different way than a schema oriented around permeability. I think a good place to begin our discussion of the Egyptian evidence is simply to ask what exactly an ancient Egyptian Tash might have looked like. And this is tricky because there would seem to be no firm agreement even within Pharaonic sources, where a Tash can reflect attempts to seemingly draw a line in the sand, as with the boundary established by Senwosret III at Semna and commemorated on his Year 8 stela. But in many other instances, it seems to refer to a wider area or more nebulous Egyptian sphere of influence that exists decoupled from linear or Cartesian notions of territoriality. And here I think especially of examples like when Hatshepsut is claiming on her Karnak obelisk that Amun-Ra is granting her Tashu extending all the way to the shores of Punt, for example. often it can be hard to determine where we should even locate these tashu physically. You know, should 18th dynasty Egypt's international political boundaries be located at rock-cut stelae near the Euphrates and Kyrgyz, established by Thutmose I and Thutmose III, many kilometers away from any traces of Pharaonic settlement? Or should scholars view ancient Egyptian boundaries as the limits of the territorial watershed within the Egyptian state as receiving taxes and tribute? Perhaps they should be situated at the edge of the area that's directly integrated into the administrative and territorial structure of the empire. Or it seems in some cases, maybe a tash may encompass some or all of these kinds of boundaries simultaneously. So because of this complexity, I would prefer to move towards a more flexible definition of a tash, where it is a royally established entity that essentially demarcates a horizon within which one would be subject to the violence of the Pharaonic state. It's a zone where the Pharaonic state could levy taxes, requisition personnel, conscript or impress individuals, appropriate goods, engage in trade, send messengers safely and partake in diplomacy, or even inscribe itself upon the landscape in the form of various monuments or fortresses. To me, this differs dramatically from the boundary-making practices of contemporary nations that are often founded upon fantasies of linear borders defining pristine, often ethnically homogeneous, self-contained nation-states in a world with no unclaimed territory. I think the difficulty of simply determining the location of precise tashu in most periods of Pharaonic Egypt, to say nothing of the challenges of establishing a cogent definition of what one physically looked like, should serve as a bit of a warning that ancient Egyptian priorities for their political boundaries did not always align with some of our own contemporary imperatives. And indeed, although maps are known from ancient Egypt, there's really very little evidence, really no evidence, that any Egyptian cartographer attempted to demarcate the extent of the Egyptian empire or even Egypt itself using very clean, neat lines clearly outlining distinct political boundaries. Here we see a purely topographic map of part of the Wadi Hammamat, but other examples, like Seti I's reliefs of the Ways of Horus at Karnak, depict land in a manner that to me reads as almost akin to the lists of conquered cities highlighted in various onomastica or monumental inscriptions. There are other peculiarities that seem to distinguish ancient Egyptian conceptions of bordering. Most notably, tashu are frequently described in personal terms, as though they belong to individual rulers. Senwosret III describes his tash in personal language in a pair of stelae dedicated in his 16th regnal year at Uranardi and Semna respectively, describing it in his address as my boundary, which you can see highlighted here on the example from Semna, and disowning any future pharaohs that might fail to fight for it. Throughout the New Kingdom, epithets of pharaohs refer to his boundary, particularly when discussing boundary-making efforts at specific locations, but also at times when describing the limits of Egyptian sovereignty granted by the gods in more general terms. The personal connection of the ruler to his or her tashu and the wider boundary-making policies of the state has a few, I think, quite important implications. First, it emphasizes how setting international boundaries was a royal prerogative. And second, such phrasing deliberately fuses the person of the ruler and the state into a single entity. And finally, the personal nature of tashu, I think, finds a fairly close parallel in ancient Near Eastern treaties and diplomatic agreements that were concluded between individual kings and had to be renewed upon the accession of a new ruler. A corollary to this latter point is that because tashu constantly needed to be reaffirmed, expanded, or refixed through royal action, it seems as though the Egyptians were not necessarily conceiving of these tashu in particular, I think we could maybe make a different case for Jeru, as permanent, almost ahistorical boundaries akin to modern borders. And I think this is underlined in the stele that we just saw from Uranardi and Semna, where Senwosret III is exhorting future kings to fight for and hold his boundary that he himself established. We're fortunate as Egyptian archaeologists and Egyptologists to have a pretty solid understanding of the practices used by the ancient Egyptians to create, fix, and maintain such boundaries. Fortresses and monumental walls, augmented by robust reconnaissance efforts, strengthened Egyptian territorial claims, certainly in the northeastern delta, the western delta, and of course in Lower Nubia as well. Still more ostentatiously, 12th dynasty and 18th dynasty rulers at times dedicated boundary stelae explicitly. The rock-cut stelae at Kyrgyz from the reigns of Thutmose I and Thutmose III may well establish Hagar el-Murwa at Kyrgyz as the southern boundary of the Egyptian Empire. But I do want to draw a distinction here between the content of these inscriptions and the content of Senwosret III's Year 8 inscription specifically, which is forbidding travel northward with only exceptions for those Nubians traveling to Murgissa to trade. I think in seeking an impetus for the Pharaonic state's use of boundary stelae to delineate international political boundaries, scholars have frequently turned to the use of boundary stelae to delimit individual fields or nomes, and understandably have noted their importance in claiming specific territory. But I here want to draw attention to the role of stelae as providing a concrete and durable stage where royal power could be displayed. Wherever they were placed, stelae were invested with both the legal power of the state and often explicitly referenced divine support. But I do want to highlight that boundary stelae do not seem to have been used all that extensively during many parts of the Pharaonic period, even when delimiting individual fields. Rare examples have been excavated or depicted in New Kingdom tomb reliefs like this one of Nebamun, 18th dynasty. But in contrast, we actually have far more donation stelae that record the total arure, or total land that had been allotted to an individual or donated to a temple. And these were often housed, it seems, in important religious sanctuaries. In many respects, this was a more practical solution, given that variation in Nile floods often meant that fields had to be resurveyed each year following the inundation. Given that such donations were also recorded and likely reduplicated in cadastral surveys, censuses, or local administrative bookkeeping, I think that the materiality of these stelae was a crucial element in their appeal. Their stone composition not only evokes a sense of permanence, but again, their assumed placement in temples, together with inscriptions that are referencing the gods as potential witnesses, together with the king, often highlights how such objects were sanctioned by the divine and backed by the legal and military force of the state. So a real important aspect of their value was their capacity to theatrically evoke sovereignty. Now, I want to highlight that I think there was a very real impetus in Pharaonic Egypt to route both people and goods along clearly defined channels, both to render such migration and commerce visible to the state, and also to safeguard against potential threats, either in the form of emigrating fugitives or invading armies. Yet transgressions of boundaries are often portrayed in the textual record as much as a personal affront to the pharaoh's authority, as they are a violation of any divinely sanctioned territorial entity. The responses of New Kingdom pharaohs to unwanted advances are telling in this regard. In the 20th dynasty, when confederations of Libyans and Sea peoples were attempting to settle in the Nile Delta, the problem seems less that such groups were settling in Egypt, but that they were attempting to seemingly do so without explicitly acknowledging and accepting the pharaoh's suzerainty. And indeed, following his victories, Ramses III apparently was settling many of the captured Libyans in camps or forts within the Nile Delta. So again, I just want to draw attention to a function of the famous Khetem or seal fortresses at Charo and Elephantina that their role was not just sealing off entry to the country, but in many respects was more analogous to the Pharaonic practice of counter-sealing an object to acknowledge receipt. Their intention is to make immigration, emigration, imports, and exports legible to state authorities. That tashu were an embodiment of the sovereign power and potency of the ruler was to a degree an end unto itself. Tashu delineating the bounds of Egyptian authority are frequently described in personal terms. And I think that this personal aspect of tashu also helps to account for the variety of practices used to mark them and the varying weights individual rulers gave to these approaches. In a literal sense, I think Egypt has as many different tashu as there were pharaohs who claimed them. So I know I'm already over time, but I briefly want to just mention Jeru, another sort of less movable boundary type that I mentioned at the start of this talk. And these, of course, are especially relevant to the Borderscape Project's study area, since Elephantine itself is at times referred to as one as opposed to a Tash. So ideologically, Kemet extended to this location, even as in the New Kingdom, administrative distinction seems to have placed some of the southernmost nomes of Upper Egypt under the jurisdiction of the king's son of Cush. I think from an environmental perspective, this is no accident. Of course, the cataracts represent a formidable impediment to clear sailing from the Nile Valley up to the Mediterranean Sea, and Elephantine is, of course, situated at the northernmost point of the first cataract. I think given the extremely limited textual evidence from the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE, we can be less certain of how this boundary was conceptualized, both among high officials and inhabitants in the first cataract region. But I think that through the foundation of the early dynastic fortress and the emergence of the walled town at Elephantine, the sporadic military campaigns and trading expeditions we're aware of, and even royal inscriptions from the reign of Merenra, we have lots of evidence to analyze. In a sense, I think what the Borderscape Project can help show is the process of an initial royal boundary that was established through carefully staged pageantry and violence, essentially not so different from a tashu, eventually transform into a more ideologically frozen limit, the jer that we see in later texts. And so just to wrap up here, I just want to highlight a few key points that, a few key takeaways here. So first, that Egyptian sources are defining boundaries not in terms of porosity or permeability, but the capacity for royal action to alter them. And I think the very idea of boundaries or limits poses a different sort of challenge to Pharaonic political theology, where a semi-divine ruler possesses, in theory, boundless political power than they do in our modern conception of borders. And I also want to note that there is this personal aspect of tashu that I discussed at length earlier. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to our discussions and any questions you might have. So.
Thank you, Oren. So we still have 5 minutes left. So are there any questions to Oren? Maybe someone in the chat?
Any question in the chat?
No?
If not, I have a question, Oren, because we always discussed about the southern border and also, you know, more even further south, so within Nubia or New Kingdom, let's say Egypt and Nubia and so on. But what about the northern borders? Because it seems to me that they are more difficult to establish. We were also discussing this morning now with Professor Siawovic about the delta. So there, what kind of evidence do you really have in the Pharaonic period, so dynastic period, for this kind of materiality of the borders? Now, do you have boundary steles? Do you have fortresses? Do you have anything of the kind?
Yeah, this is a great question, and so I think, you know, certainly for the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, I'm comfortable talking about there being fortresses potentially. Certainly in the famous literary text, Sinue, he talks about evading sentries near the walls of the ruler that I think most scholars would situate somewhere in the Eastern Delta, though it hasn't been located archaeologically, at least to my knowledge. And then certainly during the New Kingdom, we're aware of multiple fortresses, certainly at Charu, Teba, like there are a number of different sites that could seem to serve a role as a frontier fortresses, but I'm certainly not aware of any specific boundary stelae that were placed specifically, you know, at a location on the northeastern boundary. So in general, I think that it would be perhaps useful for us to think of some of these boundaries as being a bit more nebulous and fungible than we often seem to, at least in the past.
Yeah, so it seems that this kind of evidence are more connected with the border with Nubia, so with the south, no? Probably for the landscape, it's easier, or I mean, also Middle Egypt, I think the boundary status of Amarna, no? Because the landscape it's useful, it can be helpful in that sense. But yeah, it seems that there is some differences between the north and the south. And what about the deserts, like the oasis? Do we really have any kind of evidence for the border, or indeed, I mean, it's again the idea of this very royally made and fluid idea of a border?
Yeah, I mean, I completely, I definitely take your point, and again, I would much prefer us to move in the direction of seeing the state as having these sort of more flexible boundaries where there are, you know, certainly I'm thinking of evidence in the Middle Kingdom where officials talk about going into the oases to retrieve fugitives, where it's, you know, I guess we could say that these are regions where Pharaonic control waxes and wanes a little bit more than perhaps we've acknowledged in the past, and the environmental aspects of these areas, whether we're talking about marshlands in the Delta, certainly play an impact as well.
Do we have any questions in the audience?
I have a question, if I may. Just one quick question. I was wondering if the word Tash is attested in such texts as pyramid text, coffin text, the Book of the Dead, I mean in the netherworld.
Yes, it is. In fact, those are some of the only references that we have to Tash or Tashu in the Old Kingdom, at least to my knowledge. So there is an emphasis on, it's sort of used in almost contradictory ways, in the sense that at times, you know, a pharaoh is described as someone where, like, he can kind of overcome any boundary stone. You know, there's a confining aspect to them that the deceased is potentially overcoming in the pyramid texts at times.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oren. Yeah. Let's pass to the next presenter.
Yeah, it's time for Dr. Audrey Eller. Hello.
Hello.
So let me present our speaker. So Dr. Audrey Eller is a senior researcher and teaching assistant with the Egyptology and Coptic unit of the Department of Ancient Sciences at the University of Geneva. Her field of expertise is history and geography of Greco-Roman Egypt and Lower Nubia. She has published a monograph in French on nomes and toparchies in Greco-Roman Egypt, administrative realities and religious geography from Elephantine to Memphis. And today, Dr. Eller will present a paper about Lower Nubia in Greco-Roman times. Please.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So I'm really sorry for my voice. I'm trying to do my best today. I hope everybody can understand what I say. And first of all, I would like to thank Maria for inviting me to take part in this stimulating symposium, even though a number of commitments have unfortunately prevented me from traveling to Warsaw today. So, as you see on my title, I'm going to talk about the situation of Egypt's borders during the Greco-Roman period, focusing especially on the southern frontier in Lower Nubia. So before considering the question of this Egyptian-Nubian border in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, I will first briefly outline the general situation in Egypt during these periods. So at the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, shortly after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, Ptolemy I Soter established his kingdom in Egypt and took advantage of the turmoil between Alexander's various successors to create an Egyptian empire. It is commonly referred to as a thalassocracy because the Ptolemies expanded their influences on various points in the Eastern Mediterranean without necessarily attempting to connect these points in the Eastern this points to Egypt through a continuous territorial control. So apart from Cyrenaica, the modern Libya, and Syro-Palestine, which are direct neighbors of Egypt, they set out to conquer Cyprus, a large part of southern and western coast of Asia Minor, eastern Crete, and part of Thrace in the north. In these regions outside Egypt, it was more important for the Ptolemies to get their hands on certain geostrategic locations than large swathes of territory. As a result, the size and boundaries of these external possessions are often difficult to assess, especially in coastal areas. The sites south were mainly naval bases and harbors to which access was essential in areas also disputed by the Antigonids or especially the Seleucids. The control by the Ptolemies supported their economy and provided them with the timber they needed to build the ships that would maintain their rule. Historians agree that the period between 270 and 250 BC was the golden age of the Ptolemaic Maritime Empire, initiated by Ptolemy I and flourishing under Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III. However, these extended possessions were gradually taken over by competitors, notably the Seleucids. So the Egyptian borderlands that warrant examination and are most likely to provide insight into the politics of the periods are those extending westwards into Libya, northeastwards into North Sinai and Syro-Palestine, and southwards into Lower Nubia. So there is some uncertainty about the northwestern limits of Egypt, known during the Pharaonic period as the Harpoon of the West, the seventh nomes of Lower Egypt. During the Greco-Roman period, Plentine and Taposiris were the western boundaries of Egypt with variation over time. The Libyan and Mariot nomes, the latter seems to have been created in Roman times, seem to have included coastal sites west of the delta. The sources emphasize the composite nature of the population in this region, a mixture of Egyptians and Libyans. It was an intermediate area, but integrated into Egyptian territory. In this area, political and cultural boundaries do not necessarily overlap. The frontiers of Egypt seem to be marked mainly by the Nile Valley, but the political and economic frontiers are much more fluid. The status of the desert was ambiguous, and they were not included in the nome system. They were administered on a different basis. In the northeastern region, two types of demarcations seem to have emerged during the Ptolemaic period. First, an initial frontier between Egypt and the Syro-Palestinian coast, which could be described as a natural, cultural, ethnic, and symbolic frontier. And then a second frontier located within present-day Lebanon, which could be described as a political border marking the advances and retreats of the Ptolemies in this region. The natural frontier evolved during the Hellenistic period and also became political as external possession diminished. At the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, North Sinai was completely Egyptian. The area extended as far as Rafah, where Kaole Syria began. The city of Rhinocolura, so today's El Arish, was Egyptian and seemed to mark this Egyptian frontier. In the 2nd century BC, a military line of defense was built around Pelus and the branch of the Nile that flow into it, foreshadowing what happened in the early 1st century BC when the political border was pushed back towards Pelus, as Rhinocolura then belonged to the Judean kingdom of Alexander Yanaios. On the Levant side, the political border was on the Elytros River, the modern Nahr el-Kabir, north of Tripoli, which still forms this Lebanese-Syrian border for some 40 kilometers. And so for most of the 3rd century, you have this limit over there. There was also an artificial frontier effect in this region between the fertile areas on the west and the desert areas to the east. The latter, with the low population density, were of less interest to the Ptolemies. So as we will see later, Lower Nubia was the meeting point between Egypt and the kingdom of Meroe during the Greco-Roman period. The situation during the Ptolemaic period is more difficult to assess than of the Roman period, which still has many, I would say, gray areas. The Ptolemies and the Romans called the northern third Dodekaskoinos, the land of 12 miles, and the whole region up to the 2nd cataract, Triakontaskoinos, the land of 30 miles. So these names were a literal translation of Egyptian terms based on unit of land measurement, so the iteru in Egyptian or skoinos in Greek. They simply indicated the length of this territory. The Meroites called the region Akine, and then Egyptian claims extended mainly to the northern part of Lower Nubia, although there were periods where Egyptian control was thought to extend much further south. We'll see that here too, it is not an easy task to determine where the frontier was, and that we are still a long way from the modern notion of border. So before going any further, it is worth remembering that in 30 BC, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire and one of its provinces. The most important border was therefore the one to the south, in Lower Nubia. It became, de facto, one of the borders of the empire against the barbarians, this famous limes in Latin. There was therefore a paradigm shift and new expectations in the management of this region. The border of the empire had a defensive role, of course. It was designed to protect the empire, for it wasn't really effective in the event of a major invasion, because you can imagine with forces spread out over thousands of miles, it's not an easy task to block a huge group. But most importantly, on a day-to-day basis, it provided protection against raids, so I would say smaller groups. Hence, you have this construction of fortlets, towers, and fences or walls in different parts of the empire. The Romans wanted to control access to the empire and movement along the borders. In the case of southern Egypt, it was necessary to protect the fertile areas, the river and land routes, and the caravans. Fortifications were mainly used to protect the soldiers themselves. They preferred to fight in the open, as their equipment was better suited to this type of combat than from a tower or fort. It should also be noted that the presence of paid soldiers in these remote areas led to the development of towns near the garrisons and the development of agriculture to feed them. A brief summary of the key stages in the occupation of this region by the Ptolemies, Romans, and Meroites may be useful at this point. So the Egyptian control of Lower Nubia varied. Ptolemy II conquered the region around 275 BC, but it is difficult to know how far Ptolemaic control extended. So is it to the 2nd cataract or further north? Control was completely lost during the Great Revolt of the Thebaid between 206 and 186 BC to the Meroites, and regained a few years later, very likely by Ptolemy VI. Again, it is difficult to guess how far the Ptolemaic troops went and how much of Lower Nubia they controlled. In the early Roman period in 29 BC, an uprising took place in the south of Egypt with the participation of the Meroites and was contained by the prefect of Egypt, Cornelius Gallus. Lower Nubia, in that case the Triakontaskoinos, was placed under the authority of a local governor in charge of levying taxes for Rome. Of course, the situation didn't please the Meroites, who were quick to retaliate by rising up in 25-24 BC. Then again, 2 years later in 22 in Kas Ibrahim. So wary of the situation and no doubt aware of that the effort to maintain a frontier at the level of the second Cataract will be too great, Augustus renounced the southern part of Lower Nubia after the so-called Treaty of Samos in 2120 BC. And he kept only the control over the Dodekaskoinos, which allow access, maybe still, if we are not sure for this time, to the gold mines of the Wadi Alaki, and was a sufficient buffer zone. So the border seems to have remained in Yerasika-Minos, the modern Maharaka, during 3 centuries till the abandonment of the region under Diocletian in 298. So here is what we learn mainly from classical sources. But if we examine in detail the papyrological, epigraphical, and archaeological sources available to us, we face a much more nuanced reality. We realize that, in fact, we are dealing with a dynamic frontier, constantly in motion, undoubtedly very different from the modern borders to which we are accustomed. Territorial control seems to have been less important than the establishment of zones of interaction where people sought to establish centers of commercial exchange and extend their cultural influence. What do the archaeological sources say? Thanks to the excavation carried out during the auspices of UNESCO in the late 50s and 60s, before the construction of the Aswan High Dam was completed, it has been possible to identify a number of sites and determine, at least in part, whether they were occupied by Egypt or the Kingdom of Meroe. Sites which could be assigned to a Ptolemaic-Roman origin were found almost exclusively to the north of Maraka, while farther to the south their place was taken by Meroitic sites. It should be stated, however, that very few of the sites in question could be dated with any degree of accuracy. In the case of most cemeteries, it was not even possible to say whether they dated from the Ptolemaic or from the Roman period or both. We must not forget that these digs had to be carried out in a rush on sites that were sometimes already partially flooded. So, although better than nothing, the archaeological map of Lower Nubia remains forever incomplete. At first glance, it would seem that a border did exist at Maraka, but traces of one culture or another have been found a long way from this border within the territory of the neighbor. The example of Kasribrim is particularly telling. So this hill city of Kasribrim is advantageously located on the edge of one of the fertile areas of Lower Nubia and at the outlet of tracks leading either to the Dunkul oasis in the north or to Abu Hamad in the south, thus bypassing the loop that the Nile formed to the west. The settlement is a central place during the conflict between the Kingdom of Meroe and Rome. So the remains of 2 adjacent Roman temporary camps, probably built by the Roman army on its way to confront the Meroitic force at Kasribrim, have been uncovered. The Roman victory after the campaigns of 25-24 BC led to the establishment of a Roman garrison on the site. Under siege in 22 BC, the fortress was rescued following a second intervention by the prefect Caius Petronius. Large quantities of military finds have been retrieved as well as papyri. After these events, it seems that Kasribrim became part of the Meroitic state. Religious importance of the city grew as several temples are attested. Its administrative role is attested also by the numerous papyri and ostraka written in Meroitic. The occupation of the site continued after the collapse of the centralized Meroitic state. If we go back to the events of the 20s BC, it can be assumed that Kasribrim was probably not completely abandoned by the Romans following the so-called Treaty of Samos in 2120 BC. What do the textual and archaeological sources say? The Roman archaeological remains seem too important to result from only 2 years of occupation, as several authors, notably Adams, have already pointed out. It is also worth adding the footprint proskinema, so one of this act of worship, found in the vicinity of Kasribrim that mention a Greek dedicator and a date that has been understood as the year 43 of Augustus, corresponding to 14 AD. And in addition, a Greek papyrus dating from the Principate of Trajan between 114 and 116 AD, and containing a letter from a soldier to his mother should be added. The man is stationed at Selkis, so modern Dhaka, and indicates that he will certainly have to stay 18 months in another garrison. This garrison is apparently located further south, so this is not Kalabsha, and is linked to Dhaka. Returning to Egypt from this location also seems relatively complicated, which will rule out Maharaka, so the ancient Yarasika Minos. Stanley Burstein has therefore proposed that it could be Casribrim. In this case, it means that the Romans did not completely return Casribrim to the Meroites in 20 BC, but retained partial control of the fort until at least the early 2nd century AD, in what he described as part of a frontier policy that allowed for Roman military action south of the Dodekaskoinos. Indeed, historians specializing in the frontier of the Roman Empire argued that there was a certain difference between the frontier, the limes, and the zones of interaction that could extend far beyond it. The presence of Roman installations such as forts in areas far from the administrative frontier is not unusual. Casribrim would therefore be in Meroitic territory, but still used for a time by the Romans as a military outpost, although the administrative border was then located more to the north at Maraka, so south of the Dodekaskoinos. The Meroites may have tolerated this surprising situation because east of the Nile, they faced with Rome a common enemy, the Blemmyes, a nomadic people living in the eastern deserts. So a few centuries later, actually those Blemmyes would take control of the region. Interestingly, we can add that Casribrim is probably not far from the Pharaonic fortress, which was named to repel the Magi. So the Magi was the Pharaonic name given to these people of the eastern desert. The site therefore appeared to have been particularly well suited to deal with this threat. So looking further north, we see that Roman territorial control was uneven. The Roman forts are located on the west bank. A few bridgeheads were set up on the east bank, so contra Tafis, contra Talmis, contra Pselkis, the first two controlling the Kalabsha Gorge, and the third the entrance to Wadi al-Aki. It is also possible that there was a settlement of this type opposite Maraka. The sites on the west bank were connected by a network of tracks. Those to the east would have been connected by a track, I think. This is what we think, of which no trace has been found since before the fillings in of Lake Nasser. However, it should be noted that Jean Vercouter, in his publication of the site of Mérissa, pointed out that before dams were built, the west bank was less dangerous, I would say easier to travel on, than the east bank. It should also be added that only 2 temples were built on the east bank during the Ptolemaic period, so Sardab, opposite Kertasi, and Adjuala, around 10 kilometers south of Kalabsha. So it's already showing a much less marked interest in this riverbank. An Austrian recently found that Mons Claudianus, east of Coptos, mentions a particularly interesting term, ripa, which was commonly used by the Romans to designate a boundary marked by a river, such normally as the Euphrates. This ripa is in the Dodekaskoinos, and it is explained by the hostile presence of the Blemmyes in the eastern desert and should be seen as a line of military defense, not a political border. We don't know when it was set up, but it is clear that the east bank was not completely controlled by the Romans and that the Nile was used to defend the main settlements on the west bank. Thus, although the Maraka frontier is often mentioned, it must be understood that the Roman territorial control of both banks up to this point was far from total. So to sum up, in brief, there were clearly several types of frontiers: administrative, political, military, geographic, natural, ethnic, cultural, symbolic. Maraka would have constituted the administrative border during the Roman period. There is evidence to suggest that the limes at Maraka was not an insurmountable barrier, but a rather peaceful place for trade. Roman matrons even visited here, underlining the non-threatening nature of this frontier, and Roman soldiers could go to taverns built for them a few kilometers to the south to drink locally produced wine by the Meroites. This border can therefore be described as a meeting point, a zone of interpenetration between societies. So, is Lower Nubia a typical Egyptian border? In the light of what we have seen, the term frontier seems more appropriate, as border indicates a clear division between two political entities, separating subjects and territories. During the Ptolemaic period, this porosity already seemed to be a reality and resemble what must have existed between Egypt and Libya and the Levant, although in this case, a border most certainly existed during the maximum extension of the Lagid Empire to the north of present-day Lebanon. Rome's annexation of Egypt changed all this, with Lower Nubia becoming one of the frontiers of the empire. From then on, it became an area of contact between Roman garrison and barbarians, which after a brief period of conflict remained relatively peaceful for several centuries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Audrey, for this very informative presentation. And do we have any questions in the chat?
No. Any question from the chat? If not, I have some questions.
Go ahead.
Audrey, how do you see at this moment in time the first cataract region, so the original border, let's say, is it still part of the border zone of the this, let's say, extended border zone further south, or not? I mean, how do you see it?
So for the first cataract, really,
Aswan, I mean, Elephantine
yeah.
and surroundings.
The thing is, there's it depends also the period, but I really have sometimes this impression that there is still a kind of limit at this point, even though there is an extension, even from a cultural point of view, especially because during this period, the Greco-Roman period, they used the cult of Isis also to create link with temples built in this region in the south. So northern, I would say Lower Nubia. And so it's in between. Sometimes it depends for the period, but sometimes I have the impression that this is really the limit of Egypt. This is where Egypt stops. And there's something a bit different on the other side. And that this thing is sometimes more considered as a buffer zone and sometimes more integrated also inside, I would say, kind of cultural landscape and something related to Egypt, even though the population is really mixed in general. So it's kind of very fluid sometimes, and I would say, except when you have a major confrontation with really armies going and so combating each other, there are also long periods where it's mainly peaceful and that people can move, I would say, kind of freely between these areas. But then there's also this distinction between Ptolemaic and Roman period, and we see also with the Romans that they were kind of maniac with these regions, because, for instance, in the Astrakhan I showed just before, this Astrakhan was written so in the Dodekaskoinos, in one of these military camp, and was found much further to the north, so not far away from Coptos. And this is just a really random report about few people crossing the area with camels, and still they were writing everything in detail. So it's like we don't see that as a threat, but still it was recorded. So it means they have a very tight control. So even though it's peaceful and they have exchange and commercial exchange and everything, they have it seems they have a very strict control of the region, at least from they want to see the movements over there. And so if they can do it a bit further to the south and not only at the limits, so the first cataract, I think it's safer for them somehow. So this is how they use probably this land. But of course, Elephantine, like Sienne, like Philae, were also places of garrison during this period. So already during the Ptolemaic period, but also it continued during the Roman period. So it was heavily militarized, this region, for a long time.
Thank you. Question? Nothing? If not, we move on to the last, because we're going to have quite an extensive discussion session soon after.
So let's move on to our last speaker of this session. Here, Dr. Katarzyna Delelis-Dannes is here with us in person. She's an assistant professor at the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology of the University of Warsaw and also an adjunct at the National Museum of Warsaw. She's an archaeologist specializing in the socio-economic aspects of the Nile Valley's past communities. She has worked as a pottery specialist on various archaeological sites in Egypt and Sudan, dating from the 1st to the 18th century AD. And today she will speak about borderscapes in the late antiquity and medieval Egypt in the light of the ceramic evidence. So please, Kasia, go on.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and above all, thank you, Maria, for your invitation. Before I will start, I would like to emphasize that I mean, this meeting is really something. I'm very happy to participate because this is what, in fact, I started to do. I mean, using borderscapes for working on, let's say, Egyptian-Nubian connections, and it's only thanks to inspirations from Maria. So thank you very much for showing new venues. So moving to my presentation, first I would like to present some theoretical approach, and then I will show you chronologically some aspects of mostly economic borders of late antique and medieval Egypt, and I will use examples of course, of the ceramics. So theoretical approach of our understanding of borders shifted from a paradigm of a border dividing communities geopolitically, politically, geographically, politically, and culturally to, let's say, a concept of borderless landscape applied across the disciplines like geopolitics, anthropology, sociology, and recently, again, thanks to works of Maria, to the field of archaeology, let's say, of the Nile Valley. The emergence of the discussed concept in the more or less 90s also received a critical summary of the studies in 2012. So it's been like 12 years since this discussion started. The term borderscapes is still based on the territorial approach, although it would encompass the nature of borders and their complexity. Still, what I think it's important for our later discussion, it has no singular definition when it comes to the geopolitical studies. The archaeology of Egypt in the late antiquity and Middle Ages did not apply the concept of borderscape yet. However, many crucial works on, for instance, economy, especially economy of the Egyptian monasteries, challenged the idea of transformations on the political, social, and religious borders of the 6th and 8th century. But no one used literally the term of borderscapes, so maybe it's just a case of naming system. However, I would like to say that this kind of works are going on. Various excellent Paris studies, and I could list many excellent colleagues, have placed tangible evidence with the context of economic strategies, although, again, the concept of borderscapes presented above has not been applied literally yet. The examples that I would like to show you today to illustrate the idea came from those four sites presented on this map. One is the northernmost is city of Marea / Philoxenite, as now we describe it in the publications. Then there are 3 monasteries: Naklun in the Fayum Oasis, Deran Bahadra in Aswan, and Kasserwis in Lower Nubia. The late chapters of Egyptian history are distinctive due to dynamic changes and give an excellent opportunity to discuss the concept of the border in the dimension of politics, territories, religion, and socioeconomics. They emerge from administrative changes initiated by Emperor Diocletian, who introduced a new administration of tetrarchy and entered the narratives of the Coptic Orthodox Church as a prosecutor of Christians. Egypt, as an integral part of the Roman Empire, participated in the trade that connected various parts of the Mediterranean and shared similar traditions. For instance, the wine consumption patterns in Greco-Roman period shifted from alimentation reserved for elites to a standard drink. The economic relations of Egypt in the 5th century, narrated through the ceramic finds, as you can see here, demonstrated a continuation of broadly spanning networks joining the whole Mediterranean. For instance, the early attestations at the monastery of Nakloun in the Fayum oasis show that anachorets used foodstuff and vessels from the regional market, imported from beyond Egypt and available in the Fayum, like North African sigillata presented here. One of the cooking pots used in Hermitage 87 came from the so-called workshop X, possibly located in Galilee, which manufacture very fine, very, let's say, a counterpart of our modern scepter cooking pots from the end of the 4th to the 7th century. These products were also found in other areas of the Mediterranean, such as Gaul. And here, looking at these examples, I don't know if you should see the arrow. Here we have in Anahoret dwelling at Nakloun in the Fayum oasis, one of these vessels. So it indicates that a dense network of trade connections from the classic Roman period continued in the early Byzantine period. The adoption of the concept of borderscapes also requires caution to avoid so-called state-centric territorial traps. Therefore, the relations along the Nile Valley would be crucial to show African connections of Egypt, except for the usually investigated Mediterranean ones. The study of area of the First Cataract showed that while Christianity in Egypt at that time was well established, Nubia followed religious practices inherited from the Emeritic Kingdom. Despite political and religious borders, potters from this region shared similar ideas and aesthetics. What is intriguing, and this example you can see on the slide, is that some of the pre-Christian burials, for instance in Casebrim, contained Christian symbols, which might suggest individual conversion and showing that the border was not exactly sealed from the cultural point of view. While showing examples from Nubia, one should remember that the concept of borderscapes can also be adapted to historical archaeology when we are talking about Nubia, or let's say Nubian studies, which let's say shifted from a minor part of Egyptology to an independent Nubiology, and this is what Maria wrote like 2 years ago, I think. So I think when we are talking about borderscapes, we can also think how our approach in the science exactly changed, and this is also part of the concept. The 6th century and Constantine the Great's rule brought extensive building programs all over the Mediterranean, not only in Constantinople, but also in Ravenna. And like the one possibly held in Marea in the mid of this century. Its goal was to facilitate a hinterland, a station for pilgrims arriving at Abu Mena from various places in the Mediterranean. Abu Mena was, let's say, a popular pilgrimage destination at that time. This global, or let's say, I think it would be better to use Mediterranean instead of global, Connections are attested through the distribution of ceramic eulogia, so-called mena flasks, and the one you can see here. The proportions of multiple amphora types recorded at Marea demonstrated that foodstuff supplies for the pilgrimage were based mainly on imports from the Eastern Mediterranean, like amphora Ellery 1 and Ellery 4. The economic strategy also implied local production of wine and transported in amphora, Egyptian amphora 5x6, which became the most prominent container used in the trade in the region during the 7th and 8th centuries. The Arab conquest of Egypt established another territorial, social, and religious border. The studies of the Egyptian economy on the verge of Byzantine and Islamic rule in the 6th and 7th century show the complexity of the adopted strategies. Therefore, our understanding of this period should challenge the term borderscapes, really, for this chronology. So the pottery studies from those sites I present you at the beginning brought extensive data sets of ceramics and tangible evidence of economy and borderscapes. According to theoretical approach of the concept where, let me quote, space is filled with material elements that favored certain kinds of activities and impede others, by Diane Bricker. We can, and I think we should, use the pottery data sets in our research on economy and connectivity when we are discussing borderscapes. Comparison between amphora sets from those sites of the contemporary assemblages, of course, demonstrate the complexity of economic strategies. The economic empowerment of Merautis based on the pilgrimage decreased after the Arab conquest, and the town declined in the first half of the 8th century. The foodstuff deliveries arriving in packages like those imported amphora Ellery 1, Ellery 4 were decreasing as the Arab conquest contributed to the end of late Roman amphora production, and there were new types of containers that emerged, but this production really decreased after the Arab conquest. So what happened then? This gap in the market was quickly filled with regional products like those transported in amphora AE 5x6. The diversity of their subtypes documented at Marea indicates the dynamic development of regional production. The attestation from the Fayum oasis, mainly amphora from Nakrum, demonstrate that this region used different economic strategies along three main types of market: local, regional, and interregional. The local winemaking and subsequent amphora production were very well established and continuously made since the 1st century CE. And this is unlikely in the Mauritius region, when there was like almost 2 centuries of gap of winemaking in the 4th and 5th century. So those, let's say, local, regional amphora met region's demand for wine packaging and transportation. The products imported from other parts of Egypt and beyond, like Ellery 1, Ellery 4, Spateya from North Africa, were available on the Fayum markets. Still, they never played such a significant role as in the case of Marea. Therefore, after the Arab conquest, where Egyptian monasteries started to have troubles with their economic sustainability, Nakrum remained an important and vivid religious center until the 12th century. On the other hand, if we check the documentary evidence from another monastery in Middle Egypt as an example, we can see that monks really struggled, or they took a lot of efforts to find financial strategies to fulfill the new tax obligations, resulting in their really firm involvement in the so-called outside world affairs, for instance, as tax collectors. Such textual attestation are missing from the monastery at Naklon. That's why I'm also using the pottery evidence. Although the numerous amphora findings indicate that the monastery economic sustainability was deeply rooted in meeting the demand for foodstuff packaging. Furthermore, since the late 8th century, new types of regional containers appeared, and I mean amphora, Egyptian amphora 8 and the so-called bag-shaped bottles, BSB. They attest that various containers were dedicated to different food products, because otherwise, why you need to differentiate containers unless you need to pack different products. The richness of agricultural production of the region is known from the later Arabic sources, and it included cereals, oil plants, sugar, cane, flax, also fishing and salt processing. So the latter, the fishing and salt processing, extensively used natural resources. So this is also a kind of very good economic strategy. And what they were doing from all this salt and fish, they produce a lot of marinated fish, so salasmenta, and here you have the example of really well preserved macro remains found inside this BSB bottle vessel. Furthermore, there were still operational vineyards, and we are talking about 9th, 10th century, like those belonging to the estate of Caliph Abdel Malik, located in the eastern part of the Fayum. Therefore, the various amphorae contribute to the picture of the Fayum oasis as a significant agricultural region. An archive of the Coptic family, Abu Bifam, living in the village known as now as Hawara, a very well-known place for all Egyptologists, dated to the 10th, 11th century and found in the Naklun monastery, shed light on social aspects of the borderscapes of this region. So according to Christian Gobert and Michel Mouton, who studied this archive, almost half of the Fayum population at that time was still Christian, which is a really intrigue. So what we can say, using this data about Naklun, that possibly these Christian communities really played a pivotal role in the survival of this monastery. That's why they were going so well when other monasteries fall into despair. Another monastery, Anbahadra, just opposite of the biggest trade hubs in the Nile Valley, Aswan mentioned today, connecting the Red Sea and Nubia. Its proximity to the territorial border between Egypt and Nubia tempts us to adopt the concept of borderscape. The archaeological and ceramic evidence demonstrates firm, local and regional sources of the economy of Anbahadra. For instance, the so-called workshop area incorporated such functional spaces as bakery, granary, mills, ovens, oil and wine presses, and garum vasts, according to studies of Sebastian Olszok. The pottery production, which we can see here, included amphora, is attested by the kiln located in the southeastern corner of this area. The locally made Aswan amphora predominated among finds in Deir al-Bahadra, while the second most numerous group were Egyptian amphora 7 from Edfu. So we are talking about still regional production. Furthermore, and this is, I think that it is the most interesting, there were absolutely no imported Ellery 1 and Ellery 4, which is completely unlikely in Marea and Naklun. So this evidence tempts us to hypothesis that the monks living in Anbahadra, they were really capable of being self-sufficient in the production of foodstuff like bread, wine, olive oil, garum, and they used ceramics to pack and store these products while they could produce ceramics on their own. Another contribution to the multidimensional aspects of the borderscapes of Egypt and Nubia, if we were moving south, is the so-called border aesthetics. This term has been coined and rooted in contemporary art, although I think that we could incorporate it along other aspects of borderscapes to our understanding of the past. In the theoretical approach, the visual expression of art or identity on the cross-border should not be assumed merely as an illustrative process of social reality, but really a process involving human nature as well. The two examples of monasteries, the one that I mentioned before, Egyptian Deir al-Bahadra and Nubian Kasserwis, located north of the Second Cataract, brought data sets of pottery which can be considered as visual expression of aesthetics and further identity of its producers and users. Findings of tableware used for meal serving from both monasteries also demonstrate the economic strategy of the local markets and the preferences of customers. The local wares were the most abundant, as one at the Bahadra, and here we have one example, and Faras at Kasserwis. Despite the availability of other tableware in the area of Aswan, like what we know from Elephantine, like sigillata from North Africa in the 5th, 6th century, monks at Deir and Bahadra preferred to use only local wares. There was no even a single fragment of any other ware. It might suggest that they were those local wares, the Aswan tableware, were relatively easily available and affordable from the local market. And for the more luxurious tableware, those monks possibly used glass vessels like in other monastic communities, as Maria Masakowska-Gober presented for their Naklun. In contrast, monks at Kasserwis have more varied set of tableware characterized by contemporary use of local vessels and those imported from Aswan, especially in the 6th and 7th century. Those vessels attest to the complexity of the border between Egypt and Nubia after the arrival of Christianity from the Byzantine Empire into the Middle Nile Valley. This religious change impacted pottery production in many various aspects and can be easily traced through the ceramics, as David Edwards proved in one of his papers. Since the mid-6th century, some of the Nubian potteries started manufacturing tableware of shapes derived from the Mediterranean sigillata, most probably copied from the Aswan vessels. Nubian potters also followed the aesthetics of the Egyptian, or in other words, Mediterranean counterparts, which is characterized by limited decoration compared to the Meroitic period, or the previous period. It was possibly an adaptation of the new models as a part of the so-called Byzantine package, which arrived in Nubia with a new fate. This production has shifted again, possibly in a response to the Arab conquest of Egypt and cutting Nubians off the territorial connections to Byzantium. As a result, the Nubian potters started to look for other solutions, returning to their origins when they favored highly decorated vessels. Those we can see on the slide. Such painted vessels share common design concepts, such as twisted cord guilloche or motifs of birds with Aswan wares. So you have example of vessel from Aswan workshop and the one from a Nubian workshop. In contrast, such concepts like these highly decorated vessels are virtually absent in North Egypt. Therefore, the aesthetic concept visualized on the ceramics demonstrate the borderless of the 1st and 2nd Cataract region in the medieval period. And when it came to exchanging knowledge and ideas between craftsmen, the idea was, let's say, very porous. On the other hand, it's also possible that they simply use the same source of inspiration, like manuscripts illumination, and this idea was brought by Bill Adams. To wrap up and give maybe some ideas for our discussion later, I think that one should adopt or not adopt the borderscape concept in the discipline of archaeology or archaeology of Egypt and Nubia. I think the conducted studies concerning economy and ceramics often discuss liminal phases, as I said before, and those liminal phases, they are chronological, territorial, or cultural. Adopting borderscapes and using the interdisciplinary approach, I think, will help us draw a more multidimensional picture of the research part of the past, and above all, give us proper tools to analyze transformations when it comes to tangible and intangible borders, above all. As the coined concept, borderscape concept in geopolitics, there is, as I said before, there is no singular definition of borderscapes. So I would like to suggest that maybe perhaps it's time to establish one for us, and maybe this symposium, it would be a good opportunity. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kasia. So do we have any question? No one? Anybody from the... Is there anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question to Kasia? If not, I have one. Nobody, no? So I was thinking about the Aswan monastery, so San Simeon, and their pottery. And I was thinking, can it be this kind of more local production only? Because at this moment in time, there was a sort of disconnection from wider networks of exchange of more, let's say, Byzantine pottery or something like that. Do you see anything like this or no?
No, because I mean, if I understood well, it's the moment that eventually in other parts of Egypt, there's still the connection. So why not there, especially that we are talking about Aswan, a really big urban center. So I think for the monks at Anbahadra, it was a very conscious choice, simply. If you look at the monastery, how extensive, how large the complex is, how well organized with this all workshop area in the upper terrace where all the production, different kind of production is located, how water distribution is also organized. So it's kind of centralized organization, how food distribution look like, how the connection between kitchen and refectory looks like. It means that they decided to do this, because if we look at the vessels, let's say recorded on Elephantine, there is the connection. So that's why I couldn't see any of these imported vessels. There are like 2 fragments of Meretic amphora, one from Syria, and that's all. But on the other hand, in the later period, I mean, starting from the 8th century, and this is especially for like 10th, 11th century, but then we don't know what is happening. In theory, this monastery is not working anymore. But then we see a lot of Nubian vessels. So then there is another connection, rather looking south than north. This is what
Right.
I can say now.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's very interesting, because I was thinking, for instance, that there is, I don't, for who knows the Aswan area on the west bank north of San Simeon of Kubetelawa, there is a small monastery, Shiha, and close to the monastery, right outside the monastery walls, there is a small actually small ovens, and apparently they were doing pottery there too. So even a small community like that, because it's a very small monastery, apparently they were producing at least some of the pottery. So we don't have much knowledge of what of the pottery there. Was published by Juncker in the 1920s. So, and modern excavations are not published. But yeah, it would be interesting to see if also in other, let's say, satellite monasteries in the region, they follow the same kind of pattern that you can find in San Simeon.
I mean, for Kubat al-Hawa, there is a master thesis published by, sorry, I don't remember the name. It's a Spanish colleague. And there is also not much or very, very little imported vessels. So look like the pattern is very similar. And with those pottery kilns that you mentioned, looks like maybe this is a kind of characteristic of the monastic communities in South Egypt, or just in the Aswan area, when they really keep to themselves when it comes to economics, or just to their lives, to have food on their own, produce vessels on their own, and just for themselves, like they should be in the monastic rule in theory.
So this is for the monastic communities, because you said Elephantine is different.
Yes,
And
Elephantine is different. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, there are a lot of North African wares. There are wares from Asia Minor, the whole set of imported amphora, the way it should be, like you can see on other late antique and early medieval sites in Egypt. Yes, you can find it on Elephantine. That's why I see that Ambahadra is so much different, you know.
Well, it is interesting because we can see also different kind of border at the moment, which is also from different types of sites, different types of communities that have, let's say, a different layer of division than previously. So these are things that we cannot see before, but now are visible. Any question? No? Nobody there?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so now we have a Q&A. And I assume it addresses the whole day, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It's for the whole day. So if anybody wants to ask any question also from this morning or comment, or otherwise we can start the discussion. So more broadly, let's say, any question here or from online? Nobody online wants to comment or ask question? Okay, if not, maybe we can start with our discussion. So I was thinking of arranging in, let's say, in a different sections, also the discussion. We can comment, each one of us or whoever wants to comment on what we have listened today. So to make, some summary of what came out for us out of this event. But then I also ask our presenters to make a statement. So more, generally speaking, so more on methodological and scientific approach. So what we can, how is the situation at the moment in the scholarship within Egyptology and Nubiology and related disciplines about border studies, what we can do to improve it in the future. So I ask all the presenters to say a few words, and then maybe we can start from there our discussion. But as I said, if anybody has any question or any comment or any, let's say, taken of today discussion or presentations, please jump in. Okay. Thanks, Audrey and Oren, for showing your face. So we are going to move things here in the room so that we can discuss a little bit more. So who wants to start with Oriana?
I mean, I can try. Well, one of the main observation I made is that, as we said this morning, discussing borderscapes, whatever the period, I mean, whether it is prehistory or Pharaonic period or late period, it implies adopting holistic approaches and not just focusing on archaeology, on ceramology, on iconography. It implies understanding, so adopting a multidisciplinary, of course, approach. So it implies collaboration, because one person alone cannot approach really in detail those borderscapes problematic. And as far as prehistory is concerned, it is fascinating to see that all of our distinct topic of research are going in the same direction, I would say. because what Jad showed us, it goes in the same direction than what Rocard shows us. That is to say that our terminology is a problem because it gives the impression that everything back then during the 4th millennium was homogeneous somehow, that the Nagadans were one single entity, when in fact it was not the case at all. And we already knew that what we had in the Delta was different, but still it's far more complex than what we thought. It's not just that we have something different, the lower Egyptian cultures in the Delta, and then the Nagadan arrived and brought light in that region. We knew it wasn't the case, but what those Borderscapes approaches tells us is that we cannot continue ignoring this complex reality and keeping our old scheme and trying to make the archaeological material fit with those already old, in fact, views. And so ceramology shows it, rock art more or less shows it also, that it was very complex, that it was multicultural, that there were the Nile Valley dwellers, the pre-dynastic, but there were all of those groups around also, and that in fact the Nile Valley was somehow, just said, Amdulab shows it, it was a crossroad of cultures, a crossroad of entities, and that it was very complex. But so those limits, those frontiers, those borders, they were moving, they were very fluctuant, and depending on who you are back then, your perception of it was also different. So probably it was difficult for them back then. So somehow it's reassuring that it's difficult for us, but that's perfectly normal because it was already difficult back then. And I had the feeling, the wrong feeling, that it was easier during the Pharaonic period because the borders are there. We know the territory and text informs us, etc. But at the end of the day, it's not as easy as it seems, as always, I mean, of course. And so and it's good to know that there's still a lot to do. So that's also a good conclusion. So, but thank you very much, Maria, because without you, we wouldn't be there discussing all of that. And it offers lots of new avenues of research and new ways of looking at what we think we knew, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of things we didn't know. So
yeah, that's true. We are still learning a lot. So who's going next?
Thank you. I do agree with you, absolutely. And I think that we, except of being interdisciplinary, we should also cross-boarding more through, let's say, timeline with our research, because then we'll have a really bigger picture. This is one thing. And thinking about this, when I'm working with, let's say, Roman, late Roman, medieval, post-medieval pottery in, economic context, what I see that usually, I'm not saying that it's a rule, absolutely. Mostly people working with the Roman studies and trade, they call it global, when in fact it's the Mediterranean, connecting whole Mediterranean, fine, but still it's not global. Then you came to late Roman and they also say, it's global trade network. But then if you start, doing research on, let's call Islamic archaeology, Islamic period, since the 8th century, they are saying, we have finally globalization. There was nothing before. We are discovering new land. And then you came to the Ottoman period, and then you can say that you have a globalized market because you have all this stuff coming from China, from Japan, reaching West Africa. So then, yes, you can say that you have a situation like a global network like we have now. But what do you think that instead of using this globalization, you can say borderscapes, borderless contacts, maybe this is the venue that we should go and use instead of using this global market that in fact it's not the proper term. And of course it has been critically acclaimed, but I didn't, going through the literature, I didn't find any proper good idea, like, you know, you have a term that it's just like a word that, you know, clicks and you know what someone is talking about. So what do you think about that?
Who wants to reply? Well, if you want, I can also, yeah. It's always very relative, any kind of terminology, because it depends from where you stand. No? So for us already, the Nile Valley is something global, maybe in prehistoric times. So when you go, but it's also true that you're right saying that we see this kind of long history all in sectors, and these sectors don't interact between one with each other, including, for instance, the time period that I'm taking into consideration for the Borderscape project, because usually, you know, everything that happens before the unification of Egypt is prehistory, so that's not Egyptology. Everything that happens after is Egyptology. So this means that, I'm getting closer, maybe it's better. This means that scholars don't make the bridge, so they don't cross the boundary, the border of state formation of the unification date. And this is a problem, because if you want to understand long-term processes, can be economic systems, it can be cultural changes, geopolitical changes, you need to go, you know, for the long term, because things happen long before, and then you can have a threshold event, and then it continues to go on. So, and this is also a problem that we have. In this case, was good to have different perspectives, also from not only geographically speaking, although most of the people talking today were dealing with the southern border of Egypt, different times. But it's also important to put together different periods, because then all of us are coming from different fields of research. So also the Egyptologists, no? So Oren in this case is representing the classical Egyptologist. They have, yeah, their perspective that is different from yours, is different from mine. So each one of us then can put things together and see also that at the end of the day, these borders of any type are very complex features, are fluid places where people are encountering. So there is different kind of encounters, cultural, social, political, and so on, and new things are built. And probably this kind of view that we have nowadays, that borders have to be closed, sealed, and nobody has to pass them, or we don't have to interact with the other, that there has to be this kind of, you know, distinction between one and the other, because that's not good, you know, to interact and to entangle with the other. Probably was not the case even in ancient times. So, for instance, I was thinking of what Audrey said at one point, that the Roman frontier, no, yeah, there were garrisons, there were some kind of control, no, between at the border, but then, of course, the soldiers were interacting with the local communities, and just, you know, like it was supposed to be. So this shouldn't be nothing strange, but then no, you think of a Roman border as a wall and something that you cannot cross. But as a matter of fact, none of our discussions today ever mentioned really a real border. it's all the time. There is not a real wall and not a real frontier, not even in Pharaonic times when they built fortresses or walls, or in Roman times when you have the same things. So it's very fluid, very permeable. So culturally, but also from a political perspective, even during imperial times like the Roman times, it doesn't seem that you really have, if you have borders or borderscapes, because it's a more complex concept, that one, you really have more borders, borderscapes, and different perspectives, like yours for the monastic, between the monastic communities and the rest of the communities. So it's interesting to see that, probably our assumptions, modern assumptions, are biasing also our way of seeing what was happening, what happened in the past. Somebody wants to comment also from there? Yeah. Who raised the hand?
Yeah, it's me. Now,
Okay.
I was thinking that, everything that is coming out of today is really showing somehow the same, because now we are in a time of Trump wanting to build a wall, and in other country we know it exists as well. And so even when you think sometime with your former historic courses that you have some point, even of the Roman Empire, where you had the wall actually in some point, like in the UK. So we are sometimes very, I would say, misconducted by this type of events that are maybe just a tip of the iceberg, but it's not the reality for the majority of especially very large empire like Rome, for instance, where you have so many deserts. How can you control a desert? It's impossible. So, and Egypt is also very specific space with I would say huge desertic lands where you don't want to invest a lot for that, because except if you have resources that you want to get, then you don't go in those remote areas. So then you have also nomadism, and sometimes we tend to forget those peoples that also interact, which is also very interesting, because more and more when I'm working on even during the Greco-Roman period, I see what is happening with the Blemmyes and the population besides, and so they it's a good thing. They start to emerge even in scholarship since a few years, but for a long time they were a bit overlooked. And I think we tend also sometimes maybe to see Egypt as it is now, with the border that we see on the map, and that it's completely different. So there's difference between what the Egyptian thought, that this is the land where we are living, where the gods are and everything, and maybe the places where we go from time to time also to get resources, but are they really part of the, I would say, the national conscience or whatever? It's maybe completely different, and then we have to deal with different type of I would say way to see these limits, and this is maybe why we are so confused. And I would say that every time, even when I started my own research about the settlements in Lower Nubia, first I was reading a lot of things, and you see that people are they want to see where is the frontier, where is the border, where does it stop, and that it's very confusing when you read past scholarship. The people are like, yeah, but this is weird because they were mainly married, for instance, and then you have a Roman over there. What is he doing here? Is he lost, or is it a problem for the interpretation when the people, for instance, excavated over there? Is it just a random traveler going there? So we see also how we are somehow blocked. And this is really, I think, stimulating to think about this and to see it from a very wide point of view, so for a long timeline and not just for a short period, because it evolved a lot. And also, I was really amazed by the definition that we can have, especially when Oren, also when you did your presentation, because for me, as a French native tongue, as a mother speaker, there's one word, frontière. And so then when we have in English border, borderland, frontier, whatever, for me first it was all the same. Then I realized a long time ago already, but that you have these tiny differences. So this is also interesting. So according to your, maybe your root, you don't think the same.
You're right. That's another point. Oren, yeah.
Yeah, just building off that, I think absolutely, like there are these sort of very deep-rooted like linguistic biases that I'm sure that I have approaching some of these topics, you know, coming from an English perspective. Yeah, just to build off of what a number of people have already raised, I think first just it was really exciting and stimulating for me to hear these discussions from such a wide chronological span. I think that and it shows, I hope, the richness of the borderscape concept that Maria's really introduced. In terms of, you know, one thing I wanted to come back to is what Kasia raised at the end of her presentation, talking about how do we move forward with like conceptually. And I can say I don't have like a particularly cogent answer, but just thinking through the different kinds of data sets that people are working with, you know, to me, one at least starting point at least seems to be a focus on processes and like changes over time, in the sense whether we're talking about changes in ceramic technology, changes in trade, but that this, to me, I think moving forward, this seems like an area that frankly, it's not exclusive to archaeology, but certainly I think of that as being a strength of archaeological research, is being able to actually go in and take a more processual approach that hopefully allows for more nuance than maybe what we've seen in the past. So I'm curious what others think about this question.
So because it's 5 o'clock almost, and Professor Tsiawowicz is not going to stay with us for the final session, for the final discussion, do you want to add anything about the discussion before you leave?
So at first I would like to thank you very much for this beautiful meeting. It's really impressive. And the general conclusion that still our knowledge is not enough. So I'm thinking that we are still should working more, and the problem is still open. So we have looking at the prehistory and as well as medieval times. So still we have not enough data for concluding it, for lack from another way, because we have something to do still. So I suppose that really a little bit difference is between so-called border in the pre-dynastic period or early dynastic period and the medieval times. So because it's easier when we have Roman Empire, earlier Ptolemaic period and so on, to try at least cross the border with a line on the map. From the pre-dynastic period is much more movable. The people are moving and nobody knows from where they come and how technologies they bring with them, or how technologies they learn on the place. So it's a big difference. So to point out is necessary to look on the problem once more, looking on the data which we have, and hoping that we have more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, you're right. We still have a lot of things to do. Thank you. See you later.